Well, what we have for you today is a picture of a guy who's cleaning up an area, something that they actually found several years ago during an excavation. Anytime they have some type of a project in Israel, regardless of where it's at, they go in and they excavate to make sure that they're not going to cover up any kind of archaeological findings. This is something that they've got a lot of money, a lot of resources behind this. And of course, what they found was what's an early Christian mosaic. And of course, according to the article, this came out of the Jerusalem Post, this mosaic is about to be released from jail because it's on the jail property. It's a prison in Megiddo is where this is at. And of course, it's believed to be the earliest mosaic dedicated to Jesus Christ. The mosaic was discovered between 2004 and 2008 in a salvage dig for the prison expansion. They were going to expand this prison, going to add a new wing onto the prison, and they had to go in. It's the law now in Israel that they go in and excavate the area and see what they find. Well, sure enough, this is what they turned up. They have these mosaics. This was actually a prayer house, is what they found, a Christian prayer house. And they believe that it dates back before the 2nd century. Maybe it could be, they said, possibly a 3rd century mosaic. But it was discovered 20 years ago, roughly, beneath the Megiddo prison, and believed to be the earliest one dedicated to Jesus. This is the earliest finding they have of anything dedicated to Jesus. And this is going to be made available for public viewing. So if you're over there driving around on Sunday afternoon, you can stop in. But the public viewing will assume probably this June, and they're going to relocate the prison. The mosaic was, of course, excavated under the authority of the Israeli Antiquities Authority. Their salvage dig was ordered by the Israeli Prison Services before it began construction of a new wing. It is thought to have been part of an early Christian prayer house and includes a Greek inscription dedicated to the God, Jesus Christ. And it's done in, we'll see, in Greek. More than 60 prisoners from Megiddo and Zalman prisons participated in the dig. So the taxpayers are getting their money's worth. 2 additional inscriptions were found on the mosaic and translated by Hebrew University professor Leah de Segni. The inscription on the north side was dedicated to an army officer named Kniess, who contributed to the mosaic floor. The east inscription is dedicated to the memory of 4 women, Firmilia, Kyriaka, Dorothea, and Carasta. The name Akaptos is memorialized in the Western inscription as lover of God who contributed the altar to the God Jesus Christ as a memorial. Finds from the site area, including remains from a Roman period Jewish village having both Jewish and Samaritan residents, a Roman army legion camp, and a Roman Byzantine city indicated the presence of a diverse cultural, religious, and ethnic population groups in the area. Archaeological evidence also points to an early Christian community whose members included Roman army officers and tells the story of Christianity before it became the official religion of the empire. Another look at this, if you will, a closer look up, you can almost see the barcode on the trowel that the guy is using here. But you can get a little bit closer look at the mosaic, which seems to be pretty well preserved. It was a pretty lengthy article, but some of the article I read said that they had actually covered this up with roofing materials and some plaster that they normally used on walls back in that time to preserve it. Somebody had done that years ago. and otherwise it wouldn't be in the condition that it's in. But that's an interesting find there. The earliest thing that they found that's dedicated to Jesus Christ, according to them. Well, their whole history is not dedicated to Jesus Christ, but it is dedicated at times to Yahweh. And we find that back in the times after they went through cycles of discipline during the time of Haggai, that they came under all kinds of issues. And of course, when it came time to return to Jerusalem under Cyrus the Great to be involved in the reconstruction of the temple, that, well, they ran into some walls, so to speak, if you will. They were hindered by people that were moved into the area by an Assyrian king. And of course, these were identified in the scriptures as the enemies of Israel. And these guys wrote letters to the Persian government and protested the building, or rebuilding, if you will, of the temple over a period during the reign of 4 kings. Cyrus, Cambyses, Bardia, and Darius. Now, Bardia, the more I read about this, it seems that this second son of Cyrus, the younger son of Cyrus, the one that was supposed to be in the throne at that time, they claimed, several sources claim it was an impostor. And that's why Darius actually had him killed and assumed the throne. Well, there's some things in history that occurred, you know, a few thousand years ago. We're probably never going to know the truth until we get to heaven and talk to these people. Some of them, of course, will be there, and we'll be able to talk to them and understand what's going on. The other things that we might put in our frame of reference for the Persians is that their calendars that they used at that time in history and still go by today is a solar calendar, while the Hebrews used a lunar calendar. And of course, most of our predecessors used Julian calendars. Now we use Gregorian calendar today. The Persians used a solar calendar. So it's something that's been done. We looked at these calendars recently. I'll go ahead and pull these up in case you weren't here where you can get a look at them. And these are some pieces, if you will, of lunar calendars that started out pretty simple over here on the left and became more advanced as time went on. And they even had some that were, if you will, incorporated animals, and eventually the zodiac. The Persian solar calendars eventually incorporated the zodiac into their calendars. This is a Sumerian calendar that's made of metal. Sumerian, a lunar calendar. Sumerians are credited with being the first people that used the lunar calendar. You remember, if we go back to Genesis, that God set certain things in the heavens for seasons, for signs, and of course, that's why the Jews use a lunar calendar. That's why some of these ancient civilizations also use a solar calendar. They're able to determine how time goes by based on sunrise, sunset, what have you. But they sometimes begin a week on a different day. The solar calendar people, they begin the week on Saturday and it ends on Friday. You know, we look at Sunday as the beginning of the week, basically ending on Saturday. Some people don't exactly look at it that way, but that's the way it is, if you will. But then, you know, a Hebrew calendar day, we have all the months of the year. If we look at the modern Hebrew calendar, well, it looks similar to ours. This is a 2017 calendar here. But when we deal with the Persian solar calendar, this one's had the zodiac incorporated on it. And of course, it's got all the months around, similar to the lunar calendar, if you will, in the layout. And of course, they were different back in time for them. I didn't find any images that I thought there were anything significant, but a lot of that stuff from that time in history is now been destroyed, nowhere to be found, if you will. But talking about our study of Haggai so far, trying to do a brief, quick review here, and then we'll get into what we're studying right now. But we learned that Haggai is one of the 12 minor prophets of the Old Testament. And of course, Haggai is the name in the book, internal evidence. We don't know for sure if Haggai wrote the book. It could have been written by a scribe. Sometimes I look at it as I read through it over and over again, and I think, well, this could have been written by a scribe. But it's credited to Haggai, and there is internal and external evidence that tells us that he certainly had things to do with this book. And of course, it's supported by Old and New Testament writers and by some Dead Sea Scroll fragments. And Haggai's family history, if you will, the scriptures are silent. It tells us nothing about any of his descendants or ancestors. Haggai means festive or festival, and of course we learned that people believed that he was named that because he was born during a feast, or they anticipated returning to Jerusalem and having a feast when they rebuilt the temple. Haggai was an older man, and he prophesied at the same time as Zechariah, and we'll be studying Zechariah once we get done with Haggai. And we know that Zechariah was a young man based on a vision he had, and one of the angels in the vision referred to him as a young man. So he was probably born in captivity, and we believe that Zerubbabel, one of our main characters in this, was also born in captivity. Haggai began his ministry about 15 years after the first return to Jerusalem at about 520 BC. He was there. Something that we know for sure he was there, but God basically activated him in the second year of the reign of Darius down to the day. We know what day that is. Haggai prophesied during a 14 to 15 week period during the second year in the reign of Darius in August through December of 520 BC. And according to several sources, he began prophesying on August the 29th of 520 BC. Haggai's message from the Lord encouraged the people to consider their priorities and return to the reconstruction of the temple. Some of the things that the Lord says coming up, we'll see this, and he poses questions as it goes along to make these people think about what's going on in their lives in the world. But if the Hebrews return to the reconstruction of the temple, the Lord promised to be with them and to bless them. See, that's it. It's all about where your priorities are. That's what it was with these people. That's what it is for us today. When we think about this and the dating that we started out with in this book, we have to understand that if there's something important that happens in your life, write it down. Do something with it. Note it somewhere. When I look around in our civilization today and I think about things like that, well, we have certain holidays that we note every year and stuff like that. But about the only other time I see dates that are out there that are inscribed on anything is when you go to the cemetery. And we see this person was born on a certain day and they died on a certain day. And it seems that other than people who are journalists or writers who record certain things like that, they don't do anything like that. I know when we first assembled together that was October the 7th of 2018. And wasn't long after that, just a couple of weeks later, we were incorporated, and not long after that, we had a business meeting. We opened up membership for anybody who wanted to become part of this church. All those things happened in a short period of time, and we've got all that information noted and kept. Secretary keeps copies of it. I've got copies of it, the deacons. So these are things that are important to us in history. But that's the one thing that we have to understand about God. If we're busy about God's business, if we're applying in our Christian way of life, God will bless us. And that's how we know He's with us all the time. We know He's omniscient, He's omnipresent, and we know that He's omnipotent. So he has the power to be anywhere at any time, and the power to help us get through the Christian way of life. When the remnant of the people complete the temple, the Lord said he would be pleased with their work, and of course he would be glorified. The Lord told the people to take courage, not be afraid, because he was with them. And he said the glory of his house would be greater than before, and the Lord promised to give peace in Jerusalem. Well, this is something, considering all these things, we take a few moments and reflect on things. What do you think they found when they returned to Jerusalem and the ruins of the city and the temple that had been sitting there for 70 years? Things were probably overgrown, dirty, insects, rodents, who knows what all was there. There was a lot of things they had to do. A lot of it could have been, covered up by, a couple inches of dirt or something. There's just so many things that they had to deal with when they went back just to get started. And one of the things that we'll find out as we go along is there was more than one time they came to Jerusalem to work on the temple. And of course, they started off with a leader that some scholars believe is the same guy, but it's not. Doesn't appear to be. Some people have even said, well, you have the Bible has a Babylonian designation for the guy's name, and you also have a Persian designation for his name. Well, that's not the case. That's not the case. And of course, that guy is Sheshbazzar. So we'll talk about him a little bit as we move along today. But hopefully you got your notes picked up, and the new notes will begin on page 10. But as we were finishing up in verse 2 of our study, we were talking about the time for the house of the Lord to be rebuilt. And this is something that God basically says that the people, this people, if you will, not referring to the people that were released from captivity to come back to Jerusalem and work on the temple, instead of referring to them as his chosen people or my people, he referred to them as this people. It's almost as like he's saying, well, yeah. Well, I don't know these people. These people aren't acting like the people that I chose or my people. But it's something that it's almost as if there's some contempt in what he says about these people. But the Lord's message, of course, he's going to use their words against them, if you will. And this is something that he does basically for effect. And of course, we're going to see a little bit of literary devices involved in what's going on here, some repetition, if you will. And of course, we're going to see a rhetorical question that's going to be followed by a command. But in verse 2, it says, thus says the Lord of hosts, this people says, the time has not come, even the time for the house of the Lord to be rebuilt. But of course, we know the background of this. These people were delayed. They'd been frightened. They've been terrified by what's been going on with the people in the land. And this has been going on for several years. And they built their own houses and planted gardens and, kind of went into farming and all this kind of stuff. And things weren't working out so far for them very well at all. But they just kind of let the reconstruction project go. They weren't working on it anymore. And the Lord says, the time has not come, even the time for the house of the Lord to be rebuilt. That's one of the things about these people, if you will. There's been times in their history that the temple and the religious system was the center of their lives. It was the center of their lives. This was their thing as believers in Yahweh. This is something that their whole existence, those that were positive to God's plan, their whole existence just encompassed what was going on at the temple. That's one of the things when you look at Jesus' times, a couple thousand years after this time, and we consider this and say, well, we see certain people involved, and the scriptures tell us about certain people like Zacharias and Elizabeth and Mary and a few other characters that, like John the Baptist, that seem to be positive to God's plan, but most of the people aren't. And of course, at this time, we've got people that are afraid, they're discouraged, they don't know what to do. Can you imagine what it would be like for them, given the fact that they were hauled off 70 years before by the Babylonians? Yeah. One of their kings, they slaughtered his sons before him, put his eyes out. That's pretty brutal. I haven't heard anybody doing that in a long time. Have you? No, I didn't think so. But, and then they hauled him off to Babylon. They deported all the people. Now you got the Persians that have come along and conquered that people. Do you think that they may have thought that the Persians were a little bit tougher than the Babylonians? Maybe a little more brutal, a little more evil than the Babylonians? Well, if you could conquer the Babylonians, you were somebody back in that day and time. But that's the whole thing. The Lord's message is going to use their own words to express the current conditions and negative attitudes that demonstrate the concerns and the priorities of the people at that time. Where are they at? Well, they're living in their own houses. They're growing their own gardens. They're doing their own thing. But there ain't no temple. They've got priests. They've got the Levitical priesthood there. They've got everything, all the utensils for the temple. What did they do with them? They were given out to Sheshbazzar. That's one of the things about Sheshbazzar in this whole deal. We don't have the Lord speaking to him like he did Zerubbabel and Joshua. Sheshbazzar was all business, evidently. He got in there, did his thing, disappeared from history. But that's it. They're living in their own homes. And their words and actions suggest that they didn't care if the Lord lived in his house or not. Picking up where we left off in point 31. Top of the page, 10. The August message on the new moon. It kind of sounds romantic, doesn't it? That's when it happened. In August. The new moon. 31, the house of the Lord, which is Beith Yahweh, is a title for the temple that God will inhabit when the reconstruction is completed around circa 517, 516 BC, according to God's command and the decree of Cyrus as recorded by Ezra. So this is an upcoming event from what we're looking at right now, but if we look at Ezra chapter 6, Ezra chapter 6, verses 14 through 16. And Ezra, of course, is our historian that's covering all these events, if you will. And of course, he calls the house of the Lord the house of God. He's got a different title. That's what you have when you have different writers in their own style. They call certain things, certain buildings, if you will, by certain names. But of course, we know that We're talking about the same building, if you will. But he records in history, and the elders, in verse 14, of the Jews were successful in building through the prophesying of Haggai, the prophet, and Zechariah, the son of Iddo. And they finished building according to the command of God of Israel and the decree of Cyrus, Darius, and Artaxerxes, king of Persia. This temple was completed on the 3rd day of the month, Adar. It was the 6th year of the reign of King Darius. So this is something that we stop and look at this and we say, well, this went 6 years into the reign of Darius that they worked on this and finally got it completed. Well, his reign began in 522 BC, so it was about 516 BC, 517, somewhere in that area, about 516 BC, that they got finished with it. Of course, the thing about it is they began in 535. So it took them a long time. Now, they didn't have probably all the resources that Solomon did, because when Solomon built this up, he had people that came from Tyre, had people that came from all over, had all kinds of just unlimited resources, if you will, when he built the temple. Resources, materials, and, of course, manpower. So, we have a little bit different situation here. Point 32. The Hebrew words, Be'ith Yahweh, the house of the Lord, appear 190 times in the Old Testament Hebrew text. The word Be'ith, 2,048 times, is the common noun used for a house or a building, a home or a household, something that's a fixed structure, but with only one word, Yahweh, it became a holy sanctuary. Now, if we look at Exodus 23:19, now this is long before Solomon's temple, where they have the tabernacle. And here we have some commandments being issued out. It says, you shall bring the choice first fruits of your soil into the house of the Lord your God. So this is something, of course, that goes on, and there's other instructions. But this is something that they're commanded to do at the time of the fruit harvest, which would be at the end of the summer. They want to bring their first fruits of their soil into the house of the Lord. This is obviously part of the beginnings, if you will, of the sacrificial system that was carried on in the house of the Lord. We look at Deuteronomy 23:18. Something that's very important for the people to know. You shall not bring the hire of a harlot or the wages of a dog into the house of the Lord your God for any votive offering, for both of these are an abomination to the Lord your God. So if you've been thinking about taking up prostitution to make more money so you can get to church, forget about it. Okay? That goes for you men too. So, 2 Samuel 12:20. Samuel chapter 12 and verse 20. It says, so David, he'd been in a tussle here, if you want to know, struggling with his sin nature after he committed adultery with Bathsheba. It says, so David arose from the ground, washed, anointed himself, and changed his clothes, and he came into the house of the Lord and worshiped. Yeah, he'd been in a bad way. God had had him down. He was sick. He was about to die. The baby that they had between him and Bathsheba died. All these things came upon him, and of course God didn't just let this happen without telling David. Nathan came to him and he told him a little parable about this guy and something that he does. Stole this guy's sheep. And David said, well, that dirty so-and-so, he ought to die. And Nathan said, that man is you. And he told him, that you're going to have issues that are going to go on for the rest of your life. I guess David was probably good that he only lived for 70 years. But anyway, he came and worshiped in the house of the Lord. Then it says, then he came to his own house, and when he requested, they set food before him, and he ate. During the time that he was sick, after all this stuff, they tried to bring him food and stuff, and he refused it. He was in a pretty bad way. But you can see, he repented, he recovered, and he went to the house of the Lord, and he worshiped. Look at 1 Kings chapter 13, 1 Kings 3:1. And here it says, then Solomon formed a marriage alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Don't recommend that one either. And took Pharaoh's daughter and brought her to the city of David until he had finished building his own house and the house of the Lord and the wall around Jerusalem. So that's one of the things that we have to understand. Solomon had all these resources. He walled up the city. He built the house of the Lord. And guess what? He also built Pharaoh's daughter her own house. So that's something, when you have time, take time and read about what went on during the time of Solomon. Very, very interesting period of history. Also, 1 Kings chapter 8, verses 10 through 13. Now this is right when they dedicated the temple. And they offered a tremendous amount of sacrifices, in the thousands, if you will. But it says it happened when the priests came from the holy place, the cloud filled the house of the Lord, so that the priests could not stand to minister because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled the house of the Lord. Then Solomon said, the Lord has said that he would dwell in the thick cloud. I have surely built you a lofty house, a place for your dwelling forever. And then Babylonians took it to the ground. They burned it. They tore down the walls around the city. They burned the king's palace. Everything that Solomon had done. And then they got conquered by the Persians. So what kind of people are these Persians? They seem to be pretty good. You can go back and rebuild the house of the Lord in Jerusalem. Let's also look at chapter 8 and verse 63. Well, here it is. Solomon offered for the sacrifice of peace offerings. This is at the temple dedication, which he offered to the Lord 22,000 oxen and 120,000 sheep. So the king and all the sons of Israel dedicated the house of the Lord. Look at 2 Kings 25. So now on the 7th day of the 5th month, which was the 19th year of King Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, the servant of the king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem. He burned the house of the Lord, the king's house, and all the houses of Jerusalem. Even every great house he burned with fire. So they tore it all up. Going back to Ezra, our historian, Ezra chapter 1 and verse 3. And here it is, part of the decree from Cyrus. Whoever there is among you of all his people, may his God be with him. Let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and rebuild the house of the Lord, the God of Israel. He is the God who is in Jerusalem. Well, the house of the Lord, obviously, is a holy sanctuary. And it would have been a terrible thing to have been these people at that particular time in history. But God had mercy on them. He just had to get them motivated, get them moving a little bit. Point 33, although they probably felt like they were between a rock and a hard place, God motivated these people in the past. But they have lost their enthusiasm and focused their efforts on personal interest and neglected their spiritual priorities and obligations. Point 34, the language reflected the attitude of these people regarding the time to resume work. The Lamed preposition with the nithal form, lehi banewoth, is an infinitive that completed the action of the verb bow. With the negative lo translated, of course, the time has not come for the house of the Lord to be rebuilt. Point 35, the nithal verb with the prefixed hey is an imperative which expressed a command in the action of the verb bana, to build, to construct, or to rebuild. And that's only appears 2 times in our context and in Zechariah chapter 8 and verse 9. Zechariah chapter 8 and verse 9. Thus says the Lord of hosts, let your hands be strong, you who are listening in these days to these words from the mouth of the prophets, those who spoke in the day that the foundation of the house of the Lord of hosts was laid, to the end that the temple might be built. So we have another prophecy at that time, the encouragement, if you will, a prophetic message from the Lord. These are messages, even though they are for encouragement of the people at that time, may not seem prophetic to us, but there's something, a message that comes that encourages the command of the Lord, of the decree of Cyrus, to be fulfilled. But they appear in the scriptures like other prophetic messages. Thus says the Lord of hosts. Point 36, what was the reason for the mental attitude of these people and their lack of application? Were they afraid the Persian government would punish them? Would it be worse than all the ways the Babylonians had punished this people in the past? These are questions, that you have to think about. What was going on with these people? After all, the Persians conquered the Babylonians, who murdered some of the people, sacked and burned the temple and Jerusalem, and deported the Jews to Babylon. So they assumed the Persians must be more evil and more powerful than the Babylonians. If we go back to 2 Kings 25, we were just in that area just a little bit ago. 2 Kings 25. Talking about these people. That's what I was talking about earlier. Then they captured the king and brought him to the king of Babylon at Riblah, and he passed sentence on him. They slaughtered the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes, then put out the eyes of Zedekiah and bound him with bronze fetters and brought him to Babylon. That's pretty cruel. Pretty cruel. Almost sounds like, maybe some of the Sicilians learned about that kind of thing later on in history. You're going to kill your children and your grandchildren. Well, anyway. 38. These people knew about the decree that Cyrus issued, but he died in battle in December, circa 530 BC. And 2 other kings reigned before Darius. So it was a son of Cyrus that stopped the rebuild. And were the Jews just waiting on the Persian government? And then again, was it a son of Cyrus? It's kind of a mystery in history. Let's look at Ezra chapter 5. Makes me feel like Keith Morrison. Was it Cyrus' son or an imposter? Back to Ezra chapter 5. Verses 13 through 17. However, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Babylon, King Cyrus issued a decree to rebuild this house of God. Also the gold and silver utensils of the house of God, which Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple in Jerusalem, and brought them to the temple of Babylon. These King Cyrus took from the temple of Babylon, and they were given to one whose name was Sheshbazzar, whom he appointed governor. Right there now, we have a word, pika, for governor. This is a word that whenever you go to the lexicons, they all say that this word was borrowed from another civilization. Some claim it's as old as the Akkadian language. Anyway, he said to him, take these utensils, go and deposit them in the temple in Jerusalem, and let the house of God be rebuilt in its place. Then that Sheshbazzar came and laid the foundations of the house of God in Jerusalem, and from then until now it has been under construction, and it is not yet completed. Now, if it pleases the king, let a search be conducted in the king's treasure house, which is there in Babylon, if it be that a decree was issued by King Cyrus to rebuild this house of God in Jerusalem, and let the king send to us his decision concerning this matter. Now that's an excerpt of the response of these people that are there to rebuild the temple. That's an excerpt from the response that they sent in regard to the protest letters that were sent by the enemies of Israel that were deported into the land by the king of Syria. They're telling us how it was. First year of Cyrus, he issued a decree, gave Sheshbazzar these utensils, he laid the foundations, and, we've been working on this, but, we're not getting anywhere. Something has to give. Point 39, had the decree of Cyrus been ignored or rendered null and void by one of his sons or an impostor? Yes. Did this person abuse their authority and invalidate the decree of Cyrus to satisfy the protests of the enemies of Judah who were living in the land? Yes. They certainly did. Point 40, maybe the leaders and workers simply did not feel good about returning to work on the temple because of the fear of the unknown. What would happen if we return to the work? What will the Persians do to us? What will these people, our enemies that are in the land here, living in Samaria, what will they do? What will they do? Would they be imprisoned or killed if they resume? Point 41, From what can be gathered and confirmed from history, it seems that the work stoppage was based on opposing the sympathy and favor Cyrus and his older son Cambyses had shown toward the Jews. And we find that in some works by Herodotus. And there's a listing right there. You can go online and search and find that. Talks about a little bit about what's going on at that particular time. 42, although the Jews had been hindered and delayed for years, it seems that the younger son of Cyrus, Bardia, or an impostor, had stopped the work by force shortly after he took the throne when Cambyses died of gangrene in July, circa 522 BC. Now we look at Ezra chapter 4. Ezra chapter 4, verses 4 through 7, it says, "Then the people of the land discouraged the people of Judah and frightened them from building and hired counselors against them to frustrate their counsel all the days of Cyrus, king of Persia." When they say all the days of Cyrus, king of Persia, the days that he was in power during the time that they had gone back to Jerusalem to work on the temple. It says, even until the reign of Darius, king of Persia, and we know that they finished it the 6th year of Darius' reign. Now in the reign of Ahasuerus, in the beginning of his reign, they wrote an accusation against the inhabitants of Judah and Jerusalem, as Ezra recalls. And he says, and in the days of Artaxerxes, Bishlam, Mithridath, Tabeel, and the rest of his colleagues wrote to Artaxerxes, king of Persia. And of course it goes on and says, and the text of the letter was written in Aramaic and translated from Aramaic. And then it goes on and talks some more about Rehum the commander and Shimshai the scribe. They wrote to, so these people were busy writing, if you will, to the Persian government to in a continuance, if you will, stopping the people from working. There was something that was going on. We'll stop right there and pick up at point 4.